here. Greetings, students, and welcome to another video lecture. Today, we're going to be exploring Chapter 2, the Orienting Frameworks for Social Work Practice. So it's very important for us to understand the larger concepts about how we do social work practice. What are some of the driving forces that really set the frameworks for how we then do the work that we do with the clients and the families that we serve. So bear with me as we're going to take our time digging through this particular process so that you'll have a better understanding of what we are trying to accomplish. So again, we're going to look at the importance of social work practice philosophy. We're going to spend a little time defining and identifying the assumptions of these 6 orientating perspectives for social work practice. So we're going to look at those individually as we move forward. We're also going to articulate the philosophy of practice based on these 3 principles that are embedded in, people, transactions with larger systems, collaboration between clients and social workers, and self-awareness. So bear with us as we move forward. A lot of work to do. So all social workers have philosophies of practice. There is an eclectic piece that looks at grabbing pieces of different types of professions and bringing in too. So there's some legal aspects. There are some pieces of psychology. So when people look at their practice philosophies, if you're looking from an eclectic standpoint, for example, then you're looking at pulling in various pieces of information from various fields to actually inform your practice. So that's just an example of what that philosophy might look like. We all carry these assumptions about people and their problems that inform our efforts to promote social and economic justice. So let's be real. Sometimes people will see folks and make judgment calls just kind of automatically about who these people are and how they came to be where they are. And that can be a very dangerous thing because it will affect how we then work with them. And then so you have to understand what you bring to the table in terms of that. And then also to look at these other particular perspectives that can maybe help you try to address some of those things. So we've got these 6 different perspectives. So we got these ecological systems, these ecological perspectives. And in this particular version, we're looking at how clients are envisioned in their environment. So in the natural environments that they live in terms of what's happening around them. So, if you are living in a lower income part of town, where rent is probably way affordable, where the population is very transient, where the park systems are not as good, where the schools are not as good, where there are food deserts, where there are no availability to get fresh produce, where there is criminal behavior that is taking place, open air drug marketing, all of these things. If you happen to have clients who live in that environment, have a perspective and actually have an impact on your client and how well they are able to kind of navigate the system or navigate their own worlds. And it also presents real problems in terms of a challenge for where they are at. So being able to work within the context of this ecological perspective means that I have to recognize where people are coming to me from before I can be able to be in a position to try to help. The strength-based perspective really looks at this whole notion of every family that you encounter has some strengths. No matter how dire their situation seems to be, there are some things that this family has done right, if not now, then in the past. And so those are the things that we need to identify as social workers and build on to make sure that these become the assets that we utilize when we're trying to help these families recover. And then cultural humility really looks at how do we look at it through the lens of the client. We live in a society that has a dominant culture that tends to drive most of everything that we do, how we think about things, how we see things. And oftentimes that's not very inclusive of a lot of populations that are not dominant. So this particular shift really looks at how do we start to meet and recognize the values that individual different cultural perspectives have on how we do our work with those particular families. Also understanding these six perspectives, this anti-oppressive practice. And if you think about most social warfare systems, they are means tested. You have to certain meet eligibility requirements. There are certain things that you have to do in order to qualify for benefits. And it tends to be oppressive. It turns people off. So there are a lot of people who could be getting assistance from various entities, but rather than go through the oppressive nature that this system puts upon you, they would rather just not be bothered and just kind of toil and suffer when they don't needlessly have to do that. So this particular perspective really focuses on making sure that social workers understand that they'll be a part of the system that continues to oppress people. So what can you do differently in terms of how we do that and not reenact that oppression that they experience every day? Trauma-informed practices is another one. And so when we think about trauma-informed practices, oftentimes we see behaviors from families and from clients that we work with, and we try to understand them, and we try to understand them through our lens without recognizing that trauma-informed practice basically says two things. It says that something has happened to these particular families, something traumatic has happened to them, or something they were not afforded some particular opportunities in the past and they were neglected in that particular format. And so as a result of those two things, one or the other or both, then you have people who have maladjusted behavior and they perform or they behave in ways that don't seem to fall into a category that makes a lot of sense for those of us who might be trying to work with them. So it's really about trying to understand the trauma that people have experienced. And then evidence-informed practice really looks at what does the research say in terms of what has worked with this population, with this kind of problem, this kind of situation, and utilizing those to make sure that we're just not spinning our wheels in terms of that. So that eco perspective again really looks at attention to the individual and the environment. What's happening for you? Where are you living? What kind of things are going on for you? It also assumes that people are constant in their interactions. The goodness of fit between individuals and their environment supports either their adaptive functioning or exacerbates challenges. And so people either are able to rise to the challenges that their ecological system provides for them and work around that, or it becomes problematic for them and they are consumed by it. And the ecological model assumes that people are inclined to achieve maximum goodness to fit within their environment. So just to keep those pieces. And so these are some other things that we have as it relates to the eco perspective. And so rather than read them all to you, I will just be silent here and give you an opportunity to read them for yourselves in terms of what is happening. All right. And so, yes, we have, critics of all perspectives. And so we want to give you all the information that we have. And so there's some things that um, people take issue with as it relates to the ecological system. So the ecological systems model is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Doesn't eliminate the mechanisms through which people and their environments influence each other. Additional theories are required to supplement the core assumptions of the ecological model. And then the model does not encompass many values important to social workers, including the fairness and social justice. So again, we look at everything through those particular lenses. And then when we do the application of this particular perspective, we have to be aware of the resource gaps. We have to look at the embeddedness of our own life and recognize how our choices are shaped by the interactions with these ecosystems, as well as look for opportunities at multiple levels to change the adversity that clients face to not translate into poor outcomes. So again, these are some of the things that we need to be aware of. The strength perspectives really looks at emphasizing often where we often emphasize problems and adversities. we really are changing the focus to look at the strength-based perspective in terms of an alternative to the deficit-based. So if I've got a family that comes in, let's say for child neglect, they're not feeding their kids properly, they're not clothing them properly for school. Um, you know, we need to address those particular issues, but we need to also not just focus on the fact that these are the deficits that this family brings to the table, because there are probably some other things that this family is able to do and does well. And so it's about how do we understand what those particular things are, how do we assess for that, and then how do we utilize that in terms of working with our families. Again, looking at these principles, we're looking at collaboration, we're looking at caretaking and well-being, we're looking at adversity may provide source of challenges and opportunities, knowing that the groups, the individuals and the families, the knowledge, the life experiences, and competencies all are part of the strength-based perspective. So again, critics have their perspective as it relates to this particular perspective as well. Some folks want to just pretty much write it off as simply positive thinking, or looking at ignoring or reframing into positive statements. Some assert that the full strength-based perspective is not fully developed practice model, well-defined techniques, not adequately supported by empirical evidence. So it's a work in progress, is what I hear. It's being argued that the strengths perspective fosters an individualistic approach to social work practice, precluding the structural analysis that promotes inequality. So again, there are some other issues that this particular model has. So as you're probably noticing that, every particular model also has an upside and maybe one side that's not so up. And this is how this application particular piece works. So I'll give you a moment here to read this as well. So if you're able to look at those things in terms of the strength perspective, then it'll take you far. Cultural humility. The assumptions that most social work agencies and systems hold about people, their problems, in helping process is rooted in Western scientific tradition. So that's us here in the West. The assumptions reflect middle-class white community standards, and behaviors of the community doesn't always necessarily meet those standards, or they're not the experience of the populations that we're intended to serve. So research shows that social workers who convey awareness of humility across culture are more likely to facilitate in client growth and empowerment. So it's about not coming into the room as the expert on this particular family, especially if you're working across cultures. There are a lot of things that you don't know just by virtue of the fact that you're of a different culture. And so it would be humbling to really try to understand the perspective that your clients are looking through, or the lens through which they are living, in terms of being able to have your orientation really start from that particular piece. So I'll give you an example of how we were able to do this at one point in time during a large meeting, community meeting, with a particularly difficult family that happened to be of Southeast Asian descent. We were looking at different aspects of what we needed to do to intervene with this family to make sure the kids were kept safe. And one of the requests from the folks in the family was that we need to have a shaman coming in and do a prayer piece with the family. And a lot of people around the table were just fairly dismissive of that particular piece, saying, well, this is a fairly significant sexual abuse case, and we really need to go to a much more scientific means. And I'm like, wait a minute, but if we are going to engage with this family and meet them where they're at, what's the harm in actually having a shaman, especially since this is something they're requesting, come in and do this spiritual cleansing for this particular family? And so with some pushing and shoving, we were able to get that piece done, but it just speaks to the importance of cultural humility. We were able to resolve that particular case, but we also did it through the lens of culture to make sure that those things were happening. So that's just an example of what we need to do, and how we can do things different when we look to that particular lens. So again, when we look at the application, I'll just kind of be silent, let you kind of read through it so you can see and understand for yourself. All right, on to anti-oppressive social work. Again, we think about our systems that we live in and operate in within our country and with our world are set up for disparities and inequity. People are marginalized. It's socially constructed for some to do well in our society and some to not do well. So, really being mindful of these oppressive social work practices and ideologies or systems of oppression that continues to bring these challenges for our clients in the helping system. So again, the anti-oppressive practice models link social justice to the mission of our profession with direct practice in individuals, in small groups and individuals. So again, it's about recognizing and coming to the realization that we live in a society that has oppression built into it systemically in literally all of our major organizations and institutions. And so if we ignore that particular piece, it will then also create additional barriers for those who don't necessarily fit into those oppressive regimes. So again, the goal here is to look at full participation of clients, irrespective of the oppressive ideologies. So, regardless to what the society has set in place, how do we best serve our clients? And then social workers are attentive to distributive and procedural justice to make sure that people are getting a fair shot. And we're really putting an emphasis on social justice here in terms of this anti-oppressive social work. um, Recognizing that people don't experience life through the lens of a single identity. Most of the time, we're black, we're male, we're gay, we're any number of different things. And it's about really, are we looking at having services and things provided for us that are anti-oppressive in nature? And I would argue to say that we probably don't unless we really think hard about how we move forward in terms of that. So the application of the anti-oppressive social work methodology. I'll let you read here. All right, on to trauma-informed social work practice. So when we look at trauma-informed, it's a strength-based approach that guides workers to know how individuals who've had histories of trauma work. So again, as I had indicated a little bit earlier, that the main emphasis here is that some of the behavior that families experiences in are involved in, as well as some of the problems, are due to trauma that they've experienced, oftentimes at no fault of their own. And so they either had things happen to them in terms of their own family and upbringing, or as an individual, or they were neglected and they didn't get things that they needed at the time that they needed them. And as a result, the behavior is maladaptive. And so, again, really looking at understanding how clients have been impacted by the trauma that they've experienced in their worlds is what this particular type of social work practice is all about. Um, Trauma can be isolating or an ongoing event. It could be a disaster. It could be witness. It could be repeated racial discrimination. It could be any number of things. It could be having been abused as a child. It could have been being neglected as a child. Uh, so again, it requires that the social worker really looks at trying to understand the trauma that their clients have experienced before they start to do meaningful work with them. Um, there are also critiques, that there always are. And some folks have pointed out that principles of trauma-informed practice are not specific to clients who've been exposed to client trauma, but who are in principle of good practice for all clients. So again, there's some conversation and some controversy around a trauma-informed practice, but again, we have to think about what our clients' needs going to actually be. And this is the application of that trauma-informed work. So I will once again be silent and let you kind of read through what some of those application pieces look like. All right. So now on to evidence-informed social work practice. And so this is basically looking at what's working now. As you know, social work is heavily involved in research. And so as different methodologies or things come to light, we actually have then the basis to move forward with looking at different types of interventions with families. And so we test those by looking at how well they work, who they work for, who they don't work for. So in other words, there's evidence or a body of evidence that supports why we should be trying this particular technique as opposed to another one. So evidence-based social work really is based out of research and the ethical principle for the profession, because that's what we do in terms of the evidence-based research. So it gives us a strategy around how to make policy and practice decisions. Um, its goal is to make that informed decision making evidence to that important question rise up in practice. So it leads us into a different place in terms of really looking at we only work on or focus on the work based on the evidence that has been gleaned from this particular practice and the outcomes that clients have actually had. So again, as always, critiques. So I'll let you take a moment and read through what these critiques are. All right. And so then the application, we're looking at adopting this evidence-informed critical mindset of practice, develop habits, asking critical questions that can be answered with data. So these are things that we have to do. Seek specialized training and supervision in evidence practice models that are relevant to your context of practice. So these are ways that we would have to look at if you're looking at moving about employing this particular techniques. These are the things that you would need to actually do. Also, principles of practice. When we think about the overlapping perspectives, the cross-cutting themes and social work assumptions about people in the helping process, the philosophy of direct practice recognize that people are embedded in the interactions with their social and physical environment. So keeping that in mind, that's the thing that helps make social work unique. The orienting perspectives share the assumptions that people have strengths, resources, deficits, and contribute to clients' problems. The orienting perspectives also share the assumption of the collaborative problem solving. So again, when we're looking at collaboration includes respect the client's strengths, worldviews, self-determination, and autonomy, the ability for people to kind of move and do things on their own. Collaborative relationships built on trust and respect guard against deleterious impact of trauma and re-traumatization, and orientating perspectives at all points of self-awareness is a cornerstone of effective and ethical practice. So that brings to a conclusion this particular lecture on the orienting perspectives of social work practice. So as always, read your lessons or read your chapters for this particular week. And when you come to class, be prepared to learn more. I'll talk to you soon.